Lot 325, thank you. First to the Gustave Le Grays. 1,000 is bid. 1,100, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, 1,500, 2,000, 2,200, 2,400, 2,600, 3,000, 3,200, 3,500, 3,800, 4,000, 4,200. At £4,200, sold then for 4,200. 124, 900.
Old photographs are now big business, and as the years pass, the fascination grows. In the auction rooms of Europe and America, these once humble images have become highly prized art objects.
Lot 43, 6,500, 7,000. At £7,000, 7,500, 8,500, 9,500, 10,000, 11,000. Selling them for £11,000.
It's odd to think that a dealer at Sotheby's might be bidding thousands for a scrap of paper with an image on it of someone who just might be your anonymous ancestor. And it always surprises me that photography, a medium which seems so close and kin to all this visual wizardry that we now use, should in fact go so far back. Indeed, the year the first photograph was taken, Charles Dickens was just a schoolboy, and Victoria, who would give her name to the coming age, was still only 7. Now, the Victorians had a passion for photographs. They made them by the billion, and millions survive, some quite possibly in your own family album. Well, we've been plundering a lot of family albums, as well as great museums and private collections around the world. And we've brought together thousands of the most original and remarkable images from the last century. Over the next 13 weeks, we'll describe the broad sweep of Victorian photography. We'll tell the story of early photography, and we'll also let you see how the pictures tell something of the story of the time, of the people and of the events which helped lay the foundations of our own age. It won't be an academic history or overly technical, but it will begin at the beginning, with cameras. Now, when you look at this television camera, packed with its incomprehensible electronics, it's hard to imagine that it came originally from something as simple as this. You see, in principle, a camera is nothing more than a dark box with a hole at one end to let in the light.
In fact, the principle had been familiar since the days of Aristotle. Light funnels through a pinhole and comes out in a cone, which then throws the bright scene outside onto a flat surface inside, even if it is upside down. Camera obscura is simply Latin for dark room. A hole in the wall let in light, then a mirror bounced the scene right ways up. This portable version helped artists trace scenes onto paper. Many painters used the camera principle, including Canaletto, and as you can see, it gave accurate perspective and made the scene more realistic. The camera obscura also became a public entertainment. Above Clifton Gorge outside Bristol, this camera obscura was built early last century. By then, the optical principles were well understood. From the periscope on the roof, light is projected through a glass lens, which then intensifies the image and focuses the scene outside onto a table. So, by the beginning of the last century, inventing photography meant finding the right chemistry, the magical substance that would somehow fix the fleeting image. Then, after years of speculation and experiment, the breakthrough finally came.
It was in the village of Saint-Luc de Varennes, in the heart of France, in this house, from that window, that the elusive image of nature was first caught and fixed. Here, in 1826, a Frenchman called Nicéphore Niepce took what we now recognize to be the first photograph. It was in a pewter plate with a coating of chemicals so crude that it took the sun 8 hours to burn an image onto it.
That photograph of the view from this window has survived, although it's almost unrecognizable. Indeed, it's so confusing that it has to be deciphered. The shape on the left of frame is the outline of the house. That blob in the background is a pear tree, and a barn once stood in the middle of the yard. The white patches on the right show that the sun had shone on both sides. The exposure was so long that the sun had travelled right across the sky in the time it took to make the first photograph, though that word hadn't yet been coined. Niepce called them heliographs. In this later one, the detail is better, but the exposure still took hours. He never did perfect the process, and he was so secretive about his discoveries that he died in complete obscurity in 1833. But by then, Niepce had taken on a partner, a showman called Louis Daguerre, who already had an international reputation. In both Paris and London, Daguerre ran dioramas, palaces of illusion, where he astounded audiences with spectacular visual effects created with painted backdrops lit up by an ingenious system of windows. This is a sketch of one tableau called The Temple of Solomon. And his backlit ruins of Holyrood Chapel were described by one reviewer as the greatest triumph ever achieved in pictorial art. Daguerre's greatest triumph, however, was to be the perfection of photography. In 1837, he produced the still life, the earliest example of what came to be called the daguerreotype. Each daguerreotype was unique, a copper plate coated with salts of silver that registered an image which could not be reproduced. Exposures took 15 to 30 minutes, so anything that moved made no impression. But in this daguerreotype, he managed quite by accident to take the first picture of a human being, this little matchstick man who stopped to have his boots cleaned, just long enough to take his place in photographic history. Yet Paris was slow to acclaim Daguerre's discovery. He even advertised it, but nobody took much notice. Then he found a sympathetic scientist who was also a persuasive politician.
The 40 most distinguished scholars in France are called the Immortals. And this is their shrine, the Institute of France, on the banks of the Seine, just across from the Louvre. A perfect venue for the historic announcement on the 19th of August, 1839, that a new art had been born of science. The art was to be called photography, and the midwife was Louis Daguerre. But on the big day, even that great showman had stage fright. So it was left to a French politician called Arago to step forward and demonstrate the new wonder. Anticipation had been building up for months. Arago's audience overflowed into the courtyards here. Outside, the Quai de Conti was awash with excited people. After a long search, the image of nature could now be captured by anyone who could afford to buy a kit. A proud France honored Daguerre, bought out his copyright, and gifted photography to the world.
While Daguerre was experimenting in Paris, unknown to him, the lord of the manor at Laycock in England had also been at work for years in a photographic process. The Squire of Laycock was a former member of Parliament, a scientist and mathematician called William Henry Fox Talbot. And back in 1835, 4 years before the publication of Daguerre's process, Talbot had actually succeeded in making a photograph of this latticed window at Laycock. The photograph was tiny, just over an inch square, but it was a negative, a fact which supports Talbot's claim to be the true father of modern photography. Fox Talbot made what he called photogenic drawings, both negative and positive, and some were simply made by exposing leaves on top of paper coated with light-sensitive salts. But Talbot was distracted by his other interests, and he neither pursued nor publicized his discoveries, and he had no inkling of the competition from across the Channel until 1839.
The news from Paris dismayed Fox Talbot. It was utterly unexpected, and it put him, he said, overstating a bit, in a dilemma unparalleled in the annals of science. Because if it turned out that Daguerre's process was the same as his, then of course all his work would be lost. So his first response was to lodge samples of his photogenic drawings with the Royal Institute in London. And he also sent off to Paris to try and establish a prior claim. But as it turned out, he needn't have bothered. The two processes couldn't have been more dissimilar. Fox Talbot had rather soft negative images on paper, whereas Daguerre had mirror-sharp positive images on a metal plate. And there's no doubt which the public preferred. The glory went to Daguerre. The daguerreotype was taken up with more enthusiasm in America than in any other country, and some of the earliest experiments were carried on here at the University of New York in Washington Square by Samuel Morse. And Morse had just invented the electric telegraph and, of course, Morse code. And while he was demonstrating it in Paris, he met Louis Daguerre. So when he came back to America, he began to experiment with photography, along with a colleague called John Draper, who's sometimes credited with having produced the first successful photographic portrait.
This daguerreotype of Dorothy Draper was made in July 1840. Now, Draper and Morse had obviously realized that it was all right to keep eyes open during long exposures, a point that obviously hadn't occurred to Henry Fitz just a few months earlier. But in fact, Robert Cornelius seems to have got there first. In November 1839, he had made this picture of himself, the earliest portrait which still survives. Soon, almost every American town had its daguerreotype parlor, and some opportunists even set out in studio boats. Disasters, floods, and famous sights were all caught by the daguerreotype as exposure times grew shorter. Photography had a particular attraction for a young and robust nation. It was a great leveller, with none of the inherited mystique of old art forms. And for a nation of immigrants, the keepsake portrait of family and friends had a special appeal. The last slave in New York was photographed in 1851. France, of course, had been the first country gripped by what the cartoonists called daguerreotypomania. Daguerre himself didn't pursue photography with much vigor, but enthusiasts with cameras quickly took off in every direction. Scenes taken by travelling cameramen were soon an offer to an eager public in 2 volumes entitled Excursions Daguerréennes, although the plates still had to be copied as engravings before the pictures could be printed. But like England, France also had its disgruntled man, Hippolyte Bayard, who tried unsuccessfully to challenge Daguerre with a paper process. Some of his earliest paper prints show the windmills that once dominated Montmartre. This strange self-portrait of Bayard as a drowned man was his protest against the way his claims were ignored by the scientific establishment. In Britain, the inventor of the paper negative process fought back more effectively, and unlike Daguerre, Fox Talbot became a determined photographer. His process had now been perfected and called the calotype, and it was put to the test in the grounds around his home at Lacock Abbey. The first photographic factory was also set up by Talbot in 1843. There, he was able to strike large quantities of prints from each calotype negative. In this way, Talbot produced the first books ever to be illustrated with photographs. His book, Sun Pictures of Scotland, showed the results of a journey to the north made when the monument to Sir Walter Scott was still being built in Princes Street in Edinburgh.
Some of the finest early calotypes were taken here in Edinburgh by the partnership of David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson. Now, like their mentor Fox Talbot, they also took photographs of the Scott Monument. But, unusually for the time, they showed the masons who built it. In just a few years in the 1840s, the partnership of Hill and Adamson produced a remarkable range of portraits, landscapes, and some of the earliest documentary photographs. And their quality owes something to the fact that Hill was already an accomplished painter. Indeed, it was painting that first turned him towards the new invention in 1843. You see, the Scottish Church had just been disrupted, and Hill wanted to honour the leading dissidents with a huge memorial canvas. But with nearly 500 faces to paint, he turned to photography as an aid to his memory, which was just as well, because that particular canvas took Hill nearly 23 years to complete. But today, it's not for painting that we remember David Hill, but for his partnership's 1,500 calotypes.
Their most famous set of calotypes is an almost documentary attempt to show the fisher folk of the village of Newhaven. Some villagers, like the fisherman Tam Linton and his children, were often posed by Hill and Adamson. This study shows a minister of the breakaway church with his devout parishioners, the fishwives. The heads resting on hands can be explained by an exposure time which was still several minutes long. The partners made many hundreds of portraits before Adamson's early death in 1848. By the end of the 1840s, the days of the precise but unique daguerreotype and the more artistic paper calotype were already numbered. The pivotal year for early Victorian photography turned out to be 1851. The first international exhibition was held that year in London, but most of the prizes went to Americans. England's poor showing was blamed partly on Fox Talbot, whose strict control of the patent seemed to be holding things back. It was also the year in which Louis Daguerre died in Paris. But the big event of 1851 was the discovery of a new process which effectively made both the calotype and the daguerreotype obsolete. It was called collodion, and its inventor, Frederick Scott Archer, actually gave away the secrets free. Although Talbot evidently had a point about patents, because when Scott Archer died just a few years later, he was utterly destitute. Yet it was his invention which allowed photography in 1851 to satisfy the craving which the public was rapidly developing for a cheap and plentiful supply of photographic images. So ended the era of the pioneers of photography, and the camera was now ready to take firm command of the rapidly expanding empire of images.
The last century saw the coming of the war photographers, and in the next of our camera series, Eyewitness of War, Gus MacDonald shows how the Victorian camera found the courage to look frankly at the face of battle.